After the trial of Moreau, we returned to Brest, from where we shortly came back to Paris, as the Marshal had to assist in the distribution of the decoration of the Légion d'honneur, an award which the Emperor had recently instituted for the recognition of all sorts of meritorious actions. In this connection, I recall an anecdote which was widely circulated at the time. In order to bestow the award on all these soldiers who had distinguished themselves in the Republican armies, the Emperor took into consideration all those who had been given armes d'honneur, and he selected a great number of these for the Légion d'honneur, although several of them had returned to civilian life. Monsieur de Narbonne, a returned émigré, was living quietly in Paris in the Rue de Miromesnil, in the house next to my mother's, when, on the day that the medals were distributed, he discovered that his footman, a former soldier in Egypt, had just been decorated. Being about to dine, he sent for the footman and said to him, "It is not right that a recipient of the Légion d'honneur should hand round plates, and it would be even less right that you should put aside your decoration to serve at table. Sit down with me, and we shall dine together, and tomorrow you shall go to my country estate, where you shall be a gamekeeper, an occupation which is not incompatible with wearing your decoration." When the Emperor was told of this display of good taste, he sent for Monsieur de Narbonne, whom he had wanted to meet for a long time, having heard so much about his wit and intelligence, and was so pleased with him that he made him an aide-de-camp. After distributing the crosses in Paris, the Emperor went, for the same purpose, to the camp at Boulogne, where the troops were drawn up in a semicircle facing the sea. The ceremony was imposing. The Emperor appeared, for the first time, on a throne, surrounded by his marshals. The enthusiasm was indescribable. The English fleet, who could see what was going on, sent several light vessels in an attempt to disrupt the event by a cannonade, but our coastal batteries briskly returned their fire. There was a story current at the time which related that, after the ceremony was over, the Emperor was returning to Boulogne, followed by his marshals and an immense retinue, when he stopped in the shelter of one of these batteries, and, calling to Marmont, who had served in the artillery, said, "Let us see if we can remember our old trade and land a bomb on that English brig." And dismissing the corporal who was in charge of the weapon, the Emperor aimed and fired at the vessel. The bomb brushed the vessel's sails and fell into the sea. Marmont tried, but with no better fortune. The Emperor then recalled the corporal to his post, and the latter took aim and fired with such effect that he landed a bomb on the brig, which promptly sank, to the great delight of the onlookers, whereupon Napoleon pinned a medal to the soldier's uniform. How much truth there is in this tale, I do not know. I shared in the favors being distributed on that day. I had been a sous-lieutenant for 5.5 years, and had been through several campaigns. The Emperor, at the request of Augereau, promoted me to lieutenant. But, for a moment, I thought he was going to refuse me this rank, for, remembering that a Marbot had figured in the conspiracy of Rennes, he frowned when the marshal spoke up for me, and, looking closely at me, he said, "Is it you who?" "No, sire, it is not me who," I replied. "Ah," he said, "you are the one who was at Genoa and Marengo. I appoint you lieutenant." The Emperor also granted me a place at the military school of Fontainebleau for my younger brother, Felix, and from that day on he no longer confused me with my elder brother, for whom he always had antipathy, though Adolphe had done nothing to deserve it. As the troops of 7th Corps were not concentrated in an encampment, Marshal Augereau's presence in Brest was of very little use, so he was given permission to spend the rest of the summer and the autumn at his fine estate of La Houssaye, near Tournon, in Brie. I even suspect that the Emperor preferred to have him there rather than in the depths of Brittany, at the head of a large army. However, any doubts which the Emperor may have had about Augereau's loyalty were without foundation, and arose from the underground plots of a General S. was a brigadier general serving in 7th Corps, a capable officer, but over-ambitious. He was regarded as untrustworthy by his fellow generals, who did not associate with him. Angered by this rejection, and bent on revenge, he sent to the emperor a letter in which he denounced all the generals, as well as the marshal, as conspiring against the empire. Napoleon, to his credit, did not employ any secret means to ascertain the truth. He simply passed the general's letter on to Marshal Augereau. The marshal felt sure that nothing serious was going on in his army. However, as he knew that several generals and colonels had engaged in some thoughtless talk, he resolved to put an end to this sort of thing. As he did not wish to jeopardize the career of those officers to whom he intended to deliver a rebuke, he thought it would be best if his words were carried by an aide-de-camp, and he chose to take me into his confidence for this important mission. I left La Houssaye in August, in very hot weather, and rode at full speed the 160 leagues between the chateau and the town of Brest, and as many again on the way back. I stayed no more than 24 hours in the town, so I arrived back completely worn out, for I think that there is no more exhausting job than riding rapidly on horseback from post-house to post-house. I had found things a good deal more serious than the marshal had thought. There was, in fact, a considerable ferment in the army, but the message I had brought calmed down the generals, almost all of whom were devoted to the marshal. I was beginning to recover from my exertions when the marshal said to me one morning that the generals wanted to denounce S as a spy. He added that it was absolutely essential that he send one of his aides-de-camp, and he wanted to know if I felt able to make the journey again. He said he would not order me to go, but would leave it to me to decide whether I could do it or not. If it had been merely a matter of reward, or even promotion, I think I would have refused the task, but it was a question of obliging my father's friend, who had welcomed me with so much kindness, so I said that I would be ready to go in an hour's time. I was worried that I might not be able to complete the journey because of the extremely tiring nature of this form of travel. I rested for no more than 2 hours out of the 24 when I flung myself down on a heap of straw in the post-house stables. It was fearfully hot weather, but I managed to reach Brest and return without accident, and had the satisfaction of being able to tell the marshal that the generals would limit themselves to expressing their mistrust of General S, being now discredited, deserted and went to England, and is said to have wandered over Europe for 20 years before dying in poverty. After my second return from Brest, the marshal rewarded me by putting me in direct contact with the emperor. He sent me to Fontainebleau to meet Napoleon and conduct him to La Houssaye, where he was to spend a day in the company of several of his marshals. It was while walking with them and discussing his plans, and the manner in which he intended to uphold his dignity and theirs, that he presented each of them with a sum of money sufficient for them to purchase a mansion in Paris. Marshal Augereau bought that of Rochechouart in the Rue de Grenelle-Saint-Germain, which is today occupied by the Ministry of Information. The mansion was superb, but the marshal preferred to stay at La Houssaye, where he kept up a great state. For, over and above his aides-de-camp, each of whom had his own apartments, the number of invited guests was always considerable. One enjoyed complete liberty. The marshal allowed his guests to do as they pleased, provided that no noise reached the wing of the chateau occupied by his wife. This excellent woman, who had become a chronic invalid, lived very quietly, and appeared only rarely at the table or in the salon. But when she did, far from constraining our high spirits, she took pleasure in encouraging them. She had with her 2 extraordinary lady companions. The first of these always wore men's clothing, and was known by the name of Sans-Gêne. She was the daughter of one of the leaders who, in 1793, defended Lyon against the forces of the Convention. She escaped, with her father, both of them disguised as soldiers, and took refuge in the ranks of the 9th Dragoon Regiment, where they assumed noms de guerre and took part in campaigning. Mademoiselle Sans-Gêne, who, combined with her masculine attire and appearance, a most manly courage, received several wounds, one of them at Castiglione, where her regiment was part of Augereau's division. General Bonaparte, who had often witnessed the prowess of this remarkable woman, when he became first consul, gave her a pension and a position beside his wife, but life at court did not suit Mademoiselle. Sans gêne. She left Madame Bonaparte, who, by mutual consent, handed her over to Madame Augereau, to whom she became secretary and reader. The second lady companion of Madame Augereau was the widow of the sculptor Adam, and, in spite of her 80 years, was the life and soul of the chateau. Noisy parties and practical jokes were the order of the day at this period of time, particularly at La Houssaye, whose proprietor was not happy unless he could see his guests and the younger members of his staff gay and animated. The Marshal came back to Paris in November. The time for the coronation was drawing near, and already the Pope, who had come for the ceremony, was at the Tuileries. A crowd of magistrates and deputations from various departments had collected in the capital, where also were all the colonels of the army, with detachments from their regiments, to whom the Emperor distributed, on the Champ de Mars, the eagles which became so celebrated. Paris, resplendent, displayed a luxury hitherto unknown. The court of the new emperor became the most brilliant in the world. Everywhere were fêtes, balls, and joyous assemblies. The coronation took place on the 2nd December. I accompanied the Marshal at this ceremony, which I shall not describe, since the details are so well known. Some days later, the Marshals held a ball in honor of the Emperor and Empress. There were 18 Marshals, and Marshal Duroc, although he was only prefect of the palace, joined with them, which made 19 subscribers, each one of whom paid up 25,000 francs for the expenses of the event, which therefore cost 475,000 francs. The ball took place in the great ballroom of the opera, where never before had something so magnificent been seen. General Sampson, of the engineers, was the organizer. The aides-de-camp acted as stewards to welcome the guests and to distribute tickets. Everyone in Paris wanted one, so the aides were overwhelmed by letters and requests. I never had so many friends. Everything went off perfectly, and the Emperor appeared very pleased. So we ended the year 1804 in the midst of celebrations, and entered the year 1805, which was to be a year of many important events. In order that his army could participate in the general jollifications, Marshal Augereau went to Brest, in spite of the rigors of winter, and gave a number of magnificent balls, at which he entertained a succession of officers and even a good number of soldiers. At the beginning of spring, he returned to La Houssaye to await the moment for the invasion of England. This expedition, which was regarded as chimerical, was, however, on the point of realization. The presence of an English squadron of about 15 ships, cruising endlessly in the Channel, made it impossible to transport a French army to England in boats and barges, which would have sunk on the least contact with a larger vessel. But the Emperor could dispose of 60 ships of the line, either French or foreign, dispersed in the harbours of Brest, Lorient, Rochefort, Le Ferrol, and Cadiz. It was a matter of concentrating them, unexpectedly, in the Channel, and crushing, by a greatly superior force, the little English squadron, to become masters of the passage, if only for 3 days. To achieve this, the Emperor ordered Admiral Villeneuve, the commander-in-chief of all these forces, to gather together, from the French and Spanish ports, whatever ships were available, and head, not for Boulogne, but for Martinique, to where it was certain the English fleet would follow him. While the English were making their way to the Antilles, Villeneuve was to quit the islands, and, returning round the north of Scotland, was to enter the eastern end of the Channel with 60 ships, which would easily overcome the 15 which the English maintained before Boulogne, and so put Napoleon in command of the crossing, while the English, on their arrival at the Antilles, would search around for Admiral Villeneuve's fleet, and thus waste valuable time. A part of this fine plan was now put into action. Villeneuve left, with not 60, but some 30 ships. He reached Martinique. The English, led astray, hurried to the Antilles, which Admiral Villeneuve had left. But the French admiral, instead of returning via Scotland, made for Cadiz in order to pick up the Spanish fleet, as if 30 ships were not enough to overcome or chase away the 15 English vessels. That, however, is not all. Having arrived at Cadiz, Villeneuve spent a great deal of time repairing his ships, time during which the enemy fleet also returned to Europe and established a patrolling force off Cadiz. In the end, the coming of the equinox gales having made sailing from this port difficult, Villeneuve found himself blockaded. So the ingenious plans of the emperor came to nothing, and he, realizing that the English would not be taken in a second time, gave up the idea of invading Britain, or at least postponed it indefinitely, and turned his attention to the continent. Before I recount the principal events of this long war, and the part which I played in it, I must describe a terrible misfortune which befell the family. My brother, Felix, who was at the military school of Fontainebleau, was a little short-sighted. He had, therefore, hesitated before taking up a military career. Nevertheless, once embarked on it, he worked with such enthusiasm that he soon became a sergeant major, a position difficult to maintain in a school. The pupils, an unruly lot, were in the habit of burying, in the earth of the fortifications which they were digging, the implements which had been issued to them for the work. General Bellavesne, the head of the school, a very strict man, ordered that the implements should be issued to the sergeant majors, who would then be accountable for them. One day, my brother, having seen a pupil bury a pick, rebuked him. The pupil replied very rudely, and added that, in a few days, they would be leaving school, and, being then the equal of his sergeant major, he would demand satisfaction for the reprimand. My brother replied indignantly that there was no need to wait so long. Lacking swords, they used compasses fixed to wooden batons. Jacques Minot, who later became a lieutenant general, was my brother's second. My brother's poor eyesight put him at a disadvantage, but he succeeded in wounding his opponent, though he received, in return, a wound which penetrated his right arm. His companions dressed it secretly. By an unhappy coincidence, the emperor had come to Fontainebleau and had decided to conduct maneuvers for several hours under a blazing sun. My poor brother, compelled to run without rest, his arm dragged down by the weight of his heavy musket, was overcome by the heat, and his wound reopened. He should have fallen out on the pretext of an indisposition, but he was in front of the emperor who, at the end of the session, would distribute the commissions of sous-lieutenant so eagerly desired. Felix made superhuman efforts to resist, but at last his strength failed him, and he collapsed and was carried away in a most serious condition. General Bellavesne sent an unfeeling message to my mother, saying that, if she wished to see her son, she must come immediately, for he was dying. My mother was so distressed by this news that she was unable to make the journey. I posted there as quickly as I could, but, on my arrival, I was told that my brother was dead. Marshal Augereau did all that he could for us in these unhappy circumstances, and the emperor sent the marshal of the palace, Duroc, to convey his condolences to my mother. All too soon, another source of sadness would come to afflict her. I would be forced to leave her, as war was about to break out on the continent. At a time when it might have been thought that the emperor had the greatest need to be at peace with the continental powers, in order to execute his design for the invasion of England, he issued a decree whereby he annexed the state of Genoa to France. This was greatly to the advantage of the English, who profited from this decision to frighten all the peoples of the continent, to whom they represented Napoleon as aspiring to become the master of the whole of Europe. Austria and Russia declared war on us. Prussia, more circumspect, made preparations, but, as yet, said nothing. The emperor had no doubt foreseen these reactions, and a wish to see hostilities break out perhaps underlay his seizure of Genoa. For, despairing of ever seeing Villeneuve in control of the Channel, he wanted a continental war to deflect the ridicule to which his proposed invasion, threatened for 3 years, but never put into action, might have exposed him by displaying his impotence in the face of England. The new coalition extricated him nicely from an awkward situation. 3 years under arms had had an excellent effect on our soldiers. France had never had an army so well trained, so well organized, so keen for action, nor a leader in control of so much power and such moral and material resources, who was so skillful in their employment. So Napoleon accepted the outbreak of war with pleasure, so confident was he of conquering his enemies, and of making use of their defeat to strengthen his position on the throne. For he knew the enthusiasm which the prospect of military triumph always stirred up in the martial French spirit. That concludes the 16th part of the story. Thank you very much for listening. Please subscribe for more episodes and leave a comment.